Welcome to Economics of Mind, Chapter 8 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. Let's consider a thought to begin with. Ambiguity is to the mind as slop is to a mechanical system. Both are necessary for movement to occur. So, what is mind? Well, there are many different approaches to this question based on the purpose of its answer. For our purposes, the mind is a space internal to a decision maker in which all aspects of experiences interact and leave impressions, as well as generate expressions that show up as autonomous behavior. Where is the mind? Well, based on scientific research, a functional relationship between brain structure and activity with various mental states and functions. In the case of experiences, the distance between objects is the same as the duration between moments. So the space within an object is the capacity for being in the moment. Now, there are several concepts we want to present, as this will give us deeper insights into how the mind is used and the nature of its optimization. So we'll be looking at savoring, flow, and mindfulness. So savoring is the focusing on an experience's most pleasurable aspects. So this is optimization over impressions. And there's quite a bit of research in the 2000s concerning this. Flow is focusing on the immediate action. This is optimization over expression. Csikszentmihalyi wrote his book Flow and did his research in the 80s and 90s. And then mindfulness. So mindfulness is the non-judgmental awareness of the present. So this is about minimizing dissonance with the immediate experience. And this goes way back to the origins of Buddhist and some other traditions. As we consider savoring, flow, and mindfulness, we're dealing with the elements of experiences that we've talked about before: impressions, expression, and how our mind is structured is dissonant with these experiences. So recall the exercise of eating bites of your favorite food, from the littlest bite to stuffing your face. Does it still have the same flavor? Right? Did you get the same enjoyment of its taste? Was your most flavorful bite size smaller than the largest bite that you could take? So, as you recall from that, it's not just the matter that you were consuming, but also the space to savor it. And that's what affects our experiences. Matter takes up space. So, for a fixed amount of space, the greater the amount of matter, the less the space to savor that matter. So physical space includes volume, mass, time. Economic matter includes quantity, value, and duration. This space also has a psychological component. It is this need for an inner or mind space, the room to reflect upon sensation and to appreciate its interconnectedness with other experiences, that economists have been challenged to bring into their models. It is the space between bits of information that enables us to have information at all. So savoring is about focusing mind on our impressions. So we can imagine a function for well-being of the form W is a function of M and S, where M is the quantity of what matters, and S is the quantity of the space to savor it. But as we said before, matter takes up space, so there is this constraint. So if S of M is the space taken up by matter, and SO is open space, right, space to savor, then S of M will be some function of the amount of matter you have, and the total amount of space will be equal to SM plus SO. So maximizing well-being, given this constraint, will show up as maximize W such that the total amount of space is equal to some function of matter. In other words, the amount of space that's going to have matter and the amount of open space. You could also consider space as bandwidth. Now, all of this suggests the following issue: the possibility of too much of a good thing. So when an individual or a society stuffs themselves so that they have no space to savor what they have consumed, hedons and utils can decrease. So in other words, their well-being could decrease. This does not negate the typical economic assumption that more is preferred to less. Rather, it is the recognition that there is a trade-off between having more things and having the space to enjoy them. And as we discussed in time as a resource in labor economics, leisure time is such a space. Now, what about flow? Well, flow is the experience of being absorbed in what one is doing. So an example would be an athlete in the middle of a competition, or an artist painting, an author writing, or a musician playing. He understood flow as the psychology of optimal experience. And that was a subtitle of his book. So he recognized the limited nature of consciousness and human information processing. So flow is about focusing mind on our expression through the external environment. It can be a profound experience, since as one becomes absorbed, one can become lost in the moment, associated with feelings of being led by intuition or a sense of higher power. So the experience of flow is a critical component to human well-being. Okay, what about mindfulness? Well, mindfulness is the practice of focusing attention without judgment on the impressions and expressions of the present moment. So this can include senses, feelings, thoughts, intuitions, with the common essential aspect of immediacy. Whereas savoring generates attachment to pleasure and flow generates an attachment to doing, mindfulness is a detached observation. This is why it has an interesting quality. It is both a detached observation and yet sort of immediacy to it. What are you experiencing now? Detachment requires space. So it's difficult to practice mindfulness when one is seeking pleasure or under time pressure to accomplish something. There is a distinction between how much attention one has available and how it is shared among different matters. So just as a reminder, we've talked about attributes of goods and consumers. That was Lancaster and Skatofsky. From a neuroeconomic perspective, it is the production of both neurotransmitters, like dopamine, and binding receptors that is required for the associated experience to be realized. So the brain is literally combining matter and space to generate experiences. Reconsidering imagination, memory, and reality. Memory is the matter that exists from what has been. Imagination is the space to imagine what is, what might be, or what might have been. Reality is the experience of space with matter. Reality is imagination, at the intersection of imagination and memory. Creation comes from imagination. Production comes from memory. And one pays to create, one gets paid to produce. Now, the next thing we're going to consider is the relationship between alternatives and consciousness. Obviously, as decision makers at the core of everything, going way back, what were the feasible alternatives? Alternatives is the space of possibility. Feasibility are the limits for manifestation. Uncertainty is the sense of probability. Energy is the capacity for movement. Impressions, the awareness of reality, and consciousness, the focus for experience. So let's go into these a little bit more. When we're talking about the space of possibility, we're talking about the set of alternatives within the mind. So this includes all possibilities the mind can consider. It is a space, a container of what can be imagined. There is also a set of alternatives of mind. So this includes all possibilities of what the mind can be. Feasibility is certainly one of the most fundamental of economic concepts. Right? It delimits what we can do from what we cannot. And as such, not everything that is possible can be manifested. How about uncertainty? An alternative that is possible is not necessarily one that is probable. Uncertainty is a state of mind where there is no alternative that seems to have a high probability of occurring. So one might feel a distinction between high and low probability. This would be a sense of probability. And just as a reminder, we talked about the certainty principle. What about energy? Well, the word energy has various meanings depending on the field of study. The commonality is that with greater energy comes a greater capacity to move the world as one wishes. So in physics, energy is the capacity to change how physical objects move. In economics, energy can mean the capacity to produce or change what is occurring in the economy. So when we say someone is high energy, we mean they are always doing a lot, even if they do not always get a lot done. Getting back to impressions. In Hindu philosophy, there is the word samsara, which means impressions on the mind. It is in this sense that impressions are our most tangible awareness of reality. If something real has happened, we are left with some sort of impression, whether it be a scar on our body, a remnant of a feeling, a thought that won't go away, or a change in our intuitions. And this brings us to consciousness. If impressions give us our basic awareness of reality, consciousness is about our awareness of our awareness. So much like the image found when two mirrors face each other, our choices of what to focus on changes both what we are conscious of as well as how we are conscious of it. And again, a reminder on the external and internal environments we've discussed previously. Right. So within the mind, there is an inventory of impressions, samskara. Each impression has an S, the time that it happened. So if we let t equal the present time, then if S is less than t, it is experienced as a past pushing the mind along. This is recalling. If S equals t, it is experienced as what is popping into the mind. What is happening now? If S is greater than t, it is experienced as a future pulling the mind toward it, or the nature of imagining. So a more tangible insight is that the brain contains an inventory of neurochemicals and communication infrastructure. And based on what aspects we focus on, we can influence what our immediate experience is. Recent work of Professor Gao at Montclair State University on emotion regulation is an example of how changing focus affects the experience of well-being. Again, as a reminder, hedons, the units of hedonic pleasure, those occur within the moment. Utils, as units of utility, occur beyond the moment. So hedons are generated from focusing attention on the most desirable experiences, weighing of presence of mind over impressions immediately available to oneself. And utils are estimated from the preferability of our actions. So weighing of benefits of expression over the events external to oneself. So hedons increase with presence value, how present we are in the moment, and utils increase with present value, how the future is interpreted as valuable relative to the present. So we want to work with this distinction of presence and present. So what about distance from an experience? Well, the nature of an experience is dependent on its distance. If d little t is distance in time, in other words, how far away your body is, and dA is distance from full attention, how far away your mind is. Right? So the distance between where your body is now in terms of time before an event occurs, in contrast to how fully attentive you are to what's going on right now. So if you're practicing mindfulness, you're trying to reduce that distance from full attention. So you may have heard the phrase a million miles away. This is not very far from being an accurate statement. When we say someone is a million miles away, it means they are not paying attention to what is happening now. So note that at the speed of light, a million miles could be described as about 5 seconds away. Right? The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. So a million divided by 186,000 miles per second is a little over 5 seconds. So if it takes a person about 5 seconds to recognize what's happening, it is as if their mind is a million miles away. It doesn't take a lot of distraction to very quickly be far, far away. So what about distance and time? So chronological time between an event occurring S and it's being experienced T. That might be measured as dt. So dt is equal to S minus t. And as we've talked about before, if dt is less than 0, then it's sight-like. If dt is equal to 0, it's feeling-like. And if dt is greater than 0, it would be vision-like. And that would be associated with experience of past, present, and future. So what about distance and attention? Well, when an event is experienced as immediate or within the decision maker, then we have dt is equal to 0. Right? It is feeling like, and in that it has the quality of presence. If a equals 1 means that an experience is given full presence of mind, right? It's fully there. And a equals 0 means the experience is given no attention. So a equals 1, you're giving it its full attention. A equals 0, you're not giving it any attention. Then dA is the distance from full presence of mind. What does that mean? A equals 1 is associated with dA is equal to 0. And as A goes to 0, right, as you get less and less attention on something, the distance from full presence of mind goes towards infinity. If you recall the discount rate and present value calculation, we would have the weight, the discount factor, at time t being equal to e to the minus rho t, where rho is that discount rate and t is the time into the future of an event. So what is the relationship between attention and discounting? We can find a time distance equivalent for attention based on an experience called dA using the following, where rho is the discount rate. A equals minus rho dA exponential. That implies that the distance would be equal to minus log of the attention divided by rho. Right? So if a person had a discount rate of 10% per unit of time, right? So rho is equal to 0.1, and their presence was at about 20% attention, in other words, A is equal to 0.2, then the time distance equivalent would be dA is equal to minus log of A divided by rho, which will be equal to about 16 units. If their presence was at 5% attention, A is equal to 0.05, it would be about 30 units. Clearly, the lower the attention, the greater the distance. What we'll do is we'll come back to this when we're considering the importance of not only getting what you want, benefit or net income in the future, but we're also going to consider whether or not you're paying attention when you're receiving that pecuniary or material benefit. Right? So the idea is you could work very, very hard to become wealthy or have a lot of the material things that you want, but if you don't have the time to enjoy it, that can be a loss of value. But beyond that, even if you've got the time, if you're really distracted, you're not going to enjoy it either. So if your mind is very distant at the time that you're going to go to a wonderful dinner with your friends, you're not going to enjoy that dinner very much. So let's consider novelty and meaning again. So novelty is the quality of newness, right? That is the first experience of its type. Whereas meaning is the quality of connectedness, that the experience resonates with or is built upon other experiences. And this can also be associated with connection to other persons' experiences. So there is a trade-off. The more novel an experience, the less meaningful it can be in that moment of novelty. Again, it could be you could have a novel experience now, and then over time it becomes more meaningful. But in the moment, novelty is going to be associated with a low level of meaningfulness of that particular experience. One caveat: if one has invested in anticipating a new moment, the meaningfulness can be induced. That has some important implications in terms of, certainly in economics and in marketing and sales, the importance of sort of psyching people up to anticipate something big. So novelty tends to be hedonic, since something is completely new for only a moment. And the savoring of novelty depends on the presence within the moment. In order to appreciate novelty, you need to be very present in that moment. Otherwise, you'll have this novel experience, and by the time you appreciate what's going on, it's already gone. So meaning can be more sentimental or utilitarian, since meaning accumulates over time. Right? The experience of meaning depends on presence beyond the moment. This then gets into questions of feasibility and whether something, is it a fantasy, and how distant is it placed in your mind. So far we've considered time as the distance to a feasible experience. What is the distance to an unattainable experience? In standard economics, the cost of an infeasible alternative is infinite. So the distance to the same alternative would also be infinite. However, if the mind is bifurcated into two spaces, one for manifestation and one for fantasizing or dreaming or imagining, then the distance to the first could be infinite, while the distance to the second could be finite. To develop a model for optimizing impression and expression could also be used for optimizing imaginating and creating, or memorizing and producing. Having multiple minds can be beneficial if each specializes in different aspects of experiences and then share their content. In other words, specialization and exchange. The difference being that instead of it between countries or between businesses or vendors, we're talking about within one's own mind, having multiple minds, and then having that specialization in each and sharing the content. Hopefully this is reminiscent of the two halves of the brain, and one tends to be more holistic and dealing with the creative and the imaginative, and the other tends to be more rational, more calculation, and then the corpus callosum being critical for the wholeness of the experience, so the two halves can communicate. So at the core of an economics of mind is a finite capacity to process senses, feelings, thoughts, and intuitions, along with sending signals to the rest of the body to act. So this shows up in the physical energy used by the brain to process incoming signals, right? So impressions, outgoing signals, expressions, and in changing itself. So transformations. So we're going back to that notion of brain plasticity. And while that is a critically important element of how the mind and brain learn and update, that plasticity uses energy. Again, we're dealing with what? Cognitive processing and executive control. Since physical energy is used to grow neurons, axons, dendrites, neural pathways, all healing processes, the capacity to change has limits. But the implication is that our brains also face economic issues concerning the optimal use of a scarce resource. In my paper, Experience, Choice, and Well-Being, we look at a model of psychological energy being optimized. And at the end of this video, we'll have a little addenda to go over that model. Now, in all of this, we have something else to consider. What are the costs of lying and self-deception? So cost and benefit. If we're going to have an economic approach and going to look at the trade-offs between costs and benefits, it's worthwhile to consider, why do we do this? Especially something like self-deception. So if we have a finite capacity to store and process experiences, then lying uses some of that capacity and creates greater cognitive dissonance. So imagining fantastical worlds may increase one's sense of well-being, be immersed or absorbed in a world that is very different from the challenging, maybe demeaning, maybe hurtful world that you live in reality. So having these fantastical worlds may increase one's sense of well-being, but at the cost of less mindfulness of consensual reality. This is certainly a big issue in what's going on in the political economic world. We end up in our little informational ghettos, not because of the fact that there's no useful information to be found listening to others or different opinions and such, but taking it in and trying to fit it into the world one already has created in their head can take a lot of energy, and it can be painful. So it's not surprising that, at least in the short run, people may allow themselves to be absorbed in a fantastical world that doesn't seem to be part of consensual reality. Likewise, lying to other people can provide a leverage over how their minds develop and what their expectations are. So this is not a statement of whether it's good or bad. It's just recognizing how these fit in to issues of economics of mind and the limited resources that our mind has. So all of this is indicative of multiverses of mind. In other words, where there are concentric eternities, something we mentioned earlier, there are going to be multiverses of mind. So as we make choices over how much matter and how much space, we are also choosing realms of consciousness associated with them, and which we shall focus on to grow and develop. So the next chapter turns our attention to this specialization of consciousness. Okay, so for those that are interested in technical details, this is the addenda, a model of energy distribution, psychological energy distribution. And so here are the assumptions we're going to make in the model. So first one, resources are finite, specifically the psychological energy available to intensify, right, so magnify, and or choose an experience. These constraints are represented as follows. E is the total energy available. EI is the energy used for receiving impressions. And capital E, is the energy used for giving expressions. And so the idea is that EI and EE are both greater than or equal to 0. It could be as little as 0. But the sum of the two cannot exceed the total energy available. So we could also conceive these as energy internalized and energy externalized. Second assumption is the intensity of experiencing an event increases at a decreasing rate as more resources are used to amplify this intensity. So this can be expressed by the following formula. And alpha is what we might call a normalization constant. Beta plays the role of what we often use in economics as a utility function, where the good or the quantity of the good is raised to a power that's between 0 and 1. And the reason why it's between 0 and 1, it means that as you have more of that good, your utility increases. But because the power is less than 1, the more that you increase the quantity, the slower the increase in utility, the traditional decreasing marginal utility in economics. The next assumption, the expected utility derived from an outcome depends on the resources used to choose the outcome. Right? In other words, the more resources are available to choose an outcome, as an expression of one's preferences, the greater the utility of the outcome. So this is a form of bounded rationality. But the idea here is that the more energy that you're using to express yourself into the world, presumably you're getting more of the world the way you would like it, and hence it's a more preferred outcome. Next assumption, if no resources are used towards expression, right, so you're not trying to do anything in the world at all, the expected utility of a random or habituated event is U0. In other words, if you don't try to do anything to express yourself in the world, to do something in the world, there is a background level of utility that you would experience from what happens. And we'll use a simple form of the utility function where the utility you do experience is that U0 plus phi times EE. And phi is greater than 0. So what's going on here? As the energy used towards expression increases, so does the utility experienced. Now, this is a very, very simplified version of such a function, and you could experiment and try other functional forms which can give you very interesting insights. But for now, we're going to something very, very simple, just to see how this economics of psychological energy can be used to explain and predict. So notice with this, the minimum energy required to generate non-negative utility could be understood as M, the minimum EE, equal to negative U0 divided by phi. So what's going on here? Well, if your expected utility of just random event, in other words, you don't try and do anything to make the world better, and you expect that you'll at least enjoy the world, even if it's completely random, that minimum energy required can be 0. In other words, you don't have to put any effort into changing the world, and you'll have a positive experience of it. On the other hand, if that background utility is actually negative, in other words, if you don't do anything, the world tends to give you painful experiences, then that minimum energy required is going to be greater than zero. So that is another constraint on how you can use your psychological energy, right? If you're anticipating struggle and pain and upset, unless you're actively doing something to make the world better, then there's a minimum amount of your energy that has to go towards working and trying to influence the world around you, which means there's less available to savor and do internal work. Next assumption, the well-being of an individual is a function of the intensity experiencing an event and the utility manifesting it. So that can be understood as W is equal to I times U. So here's the functional form. And from a technical standpoint, if we're going to optimize how much energy we do for impressions and how much for expression, we could set it up as a Lagrangian formula, as we see here. Then we do the math to optimize. And what do we find? Let's say there's enough energy that you can have that minimum amount necessary to have a positive experience. In other words, positive utility. However, if that energy is sufficiently low, in this case less than or equal to beta u naught divided by phi, then you would end up using all the energy to amplify or intensify or savor what it is that you can do. And in that case, E, the amount of energy you go towards expressing, will be zero. Okay, and again, that's only if EM is less than E. Okay, otherwise, you get this optimization, and it tells you how much will go to energy towards the impression and internalizing processes and expressive processes. On the other hand, if E is less than or equal to the minimum amount, then what ends up happening? Well, if you have negative utility, you don't want to experience that at all. EI, the amount of energy used to savor and internalize, would then be zero, which means the rest of the energy goes towards expressing, doing work. The implication is that the person has become psychologically dead and they're thing-like. Right? There's no internal life. So this is one of the ways that we can take a very simple model of this economics of psychological energy and start being able to explain what's going on in people's lives in terms of how their mind is operating by the fact that they've only got these scarce resources available to operate their minds, directions of either savoring or productive behavior or flow or even mindfulness. So that was just an example of how you can work this. There are other problems and models we could go through and develop, but that will be for a different class.